Brent didn't realize that the heavy, silver-plated letter opener I used every morning wasn't just a desk accessory. He watched me slide it through envelopes with a slow, steady hand, and he saw a man who had retired into the mundane. He didn't know that for 25 years, that same hand had signed the indictments that dismantled the most ruthless organized crime families on the East Coast. He didn't know that the business deal he was discussing over our kitchen table, the one involving my land and his silent partners, was being mentally mapped out by a man who literally wrote the state's manual on RICO enterprise corruption. Brent thought he was playing a high-stakes game of Monopoly with a grandfather who couldn't keep up with the rules. He didn't realize that in my world there are no silent partners, only co-conspirators. By the time he saw the pattern of racketeering I'd been documenting, the federal subpoenas were already in the mail, and I was just finishing my morning coffee. Welcome back to Payback Logs. Before we start this double-front reckoning, I have to ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you enjoy watching a social climber realize they've accidentally invited a federal prosecutor into their criminal conspiracy? Also, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and what part of the world you're watching from. It helps the channel more than you know. Grab your snacks, get comfortable. You're going to love it here. I live a quiet life now on a 30-acre spread of rolling Virginia hills. It's land that smells of pine needles and damp earth after a rain, a place where the only noise usually comes from the wind in the oaks. My ritual is simple. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., I clean my old service revolver, a Smith & Wesson Model 10. It's unloaded, of course, but the ritual of the gun oil, the soft cloth, and the metallic click of the cylinder is how I keep my hands steady and my mind sharp. My grandson, Jack, sits with me. He's 8, and he watches me with the kind of focused intensity that only children and investigators possess. I tell him stories, not about the monsters I put away, but about the importance of knowing who is sitting across the table from you. Always look at their hands, Jack, I told him last Saturday. People lie with their mouths, but their hands usually tell the truth. The peace of the morning was broken when my son-in-law, Brent, pulled into the driveway. He was driving a black Italian sports car that looked like a sleek, predatory insect against the backdrop of my old barn. Brent is a man who thinks status is a substitute for character. He wears tailored shirts and talks about disruptive development with a smile that feels like it was bought at a high-end dentist. He wasn't alone. He brought a man named Julian, a business associate, with a handshake that was a little too firm and eyes that moved like a surveillance camera. They came into my kitchen without being asked, bringing the smell of expensive cologne and artificial urgency into my home. "Pop, you're still cleaning that old thing?" Brent laughed, gesturing toward my revolver. "We're living in the future now. Nobody uses those anymore." "It's about the maintenance, Brent," I said, not looking up from the cloth. "If you don't maintain the tools, they fail you when you need them most." Julian sat down across from me, looking around my kitchen with a proprietary air that made the hair on my neck stand up. "This is a beautiful piece of property, Arthur. A bit under-leveraged, wouldn't you say? All this land just sitting here. We're looking at a multi-use luxury development, golf course, high-end condos. It would put this town on the map." "I like the map the way it is," I said quietly. Brent leaned in, his voice taking on that breezy, condescending tone he uses when he thinks he's the smartest man in the room. "Pop, we're not just talking about land, we're talking about a legacy. Julian's firm, Crestview Acquisitions, is looking for anchor properties. They're offering a charitable valuation, way above market. It would set Sarah and Jack up for life." He treated me like I was part of the furniture, a slightly dusty relic that needed to be moved to make room for a new sofa. They talked over me, using terms like zoning variances and escrow acceleration, assuming I didn't understand the vocabulary of a land grab. That was the first crack. Not the deal itself, but the way Julian looked at Brent. It wasn't a partnership, it was a hierarchy. And the way Julian kept checking a second encrypted phone under the table, it was a behavior I'd seen in 100 frontmen for organized crime syndicates. "I'll think about it," I said, sliding the cylinder of the Model 10 back into place with a heavy, final thud. "Don't think too long, Pop," said Brent, standing up. "The window on this kind of capital doesn't stay open forever." I watched them drive away, the dust from the Italian sports car settling on my mailbox. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I looked at Jack, who was still staring at the driveway. "Grandpa," Jack whispered. "Brent's hands were shaking when he touched the table." I patted his shoulder. "I noticed that too, Jack. I noticed that too." I walked to the den and locked the door. I didn't turn on the light. I sat in the dark and listened to the house. The first crack was small, but I knew how these things worked. One crack leads to a fracture leads to a collapse. I reached for my phone, not the one on the desk, but the one in the floor safe. I waited. The following week, the atmosphere in the house changed. It wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow, creeping fog designed to make me doubt the very ground I stood on. Brent started showing up at odd hours, always with a look of practiced, heavy-hearted concern. "Pop, I was talking to the neighbor, Mr. Henderson," Brent said one afternoon, leaning against the kitchen island while I was making tea. "He mentioned he saw you standing by the old well at midnight. He said you were talking to yourself, looking for some missing files. Are you feeling okay, honey? This property is getting to be too much for you to manage." I hadn't been to the well at midnight. I'd been in bed, reading a transcript from a 1998 racketeering case to keep my mind sharp. But Brent said it with such convincing sorrow, such a perfectly calibrated mask of a son-in-law burdened by a failing elder, that I felt the first chill of the double front. He wasn't just trying to buy the land, he was building a medical narrative. A few days later, my daughter Sarah came over. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed. Brent was right behind her, his hand firmly on the small of her back. It's a gesture of support, but in my experience, it's often a gesture of control. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "Brent told me about the incident at the well, and the fact that you left the stove on for 3 hours yesterday. We're worried. This big house, all this land, it's dangerous for you. Julian's offer isn't just about money, it's about getting you into a place where people can look after you." I hadn't left the stove on. I'm a man of ritual. I check the dials 3 times before I leave a room. But as I looked at my daughter's face, I realized she truly believed him. Brent had been drip-feeding her lies for weeks, painting a picture of a father sliding into dementia. "I'm fine, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice soft, slightly uncertain. I played the part. I let my hand shake just a fraction as I reached for my tea. I saw the flash of triumph in Brent's eyes. It was quick, the way a predator reacts when it sees the prey limp. He thought he'd broken the line. He started helping me by moving boxes out of my den and into the garage, claiming he was preparing for the transition. He dismissed my questions with a pat on the shoulder. "Don't worry about the paperwork, Pop. Julian and I have it all under control. We're going to handle the heavy lifting so you don't have to." I watched him from my armchair. Every time he spoke, I noted the inconsistencies. He'd mention local zoning boards one day and federal development grants the next. He was over-explaining, a common trait of the social climber trying to sound like a titan of industry. He didn't realize that I was documenting every word in the small black ledger I kept tucked inside the lining of my old trench coat. He thought he was gaslighting a confused old man. He didn't realize he was providing a contemporaneous record of elder coercion to a man who had spent 30 years building cases out of exactly this kind of noise. "I trust you, Brent." I looked him straight in the eye with a vacant, watery smile. "I know you'll do right by the family." "Always, Pop," he said, already checking his watch, his mind likely on the country club bar and the prestige his new development would buy him. He didn't see the wolf behind the sheep's eyes. He didn't hear the gate lock. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely.
The house felt colder that Friday night, the kind of deep-seated chill that wood and brick soak up when the heart of the home has been threatened. Brent and Sarah had left hours ago, but the scent of Brent's expensive synthetic cologne still hung in the hallway like a stain. I walked through the darkened rooms, my hand trailing along the wainscoting. I didn't need the lights. I've lived in this house for 34 years, and I know every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the joists as they settle against the Virginia humidity. I ended up in the den, sitting in the heavy wingback chair that still bore the faint indentation of my body from decades of late-night case reviews. I reached out and touched the lamp on the desk, a solid brass banker's lamp with a green glass shade. It was a gift from Evelyn the year I made lead executive for the Organized Crime Division. Evelyn. I only let myself say her name when the wind is high enough to carry the sound away. She's gone 4 years, but she is the architecture of my life. I closed my eyes, and I could hear the specific rhythmic sound of her heels on the hardwood, a brisk, confident cadence that told me exactly where she was in the house without me ever having to look up from my files. She was the one who kept the intelligence files of our social life, the handwritten address book, the holiday card lists, the notes on who was honest and who was merely polite. She had an investigator's soul, wrapped in the grace of a southern gardener. I stood up and walked to the mudroom. I opened the bottom drawer of the cedar chest and pulled out a pair of worn gardening gloves. They were small, stained with the red clay of the Virginia soil, and as I brought them to my face, the scent hit me like a physical weight. Lavender, rosemary, and the damp, honest smell of the earth. Evelyn had spent 30 years turning the rocky acreage behind the house into a sanctuary. She'd planted the hydrangeas when Jack was born. She'd fought the hemlock and the briars to give us a view of the valley. And now, Brent, a man who couldn't tell a weed from a wildflower, wanted to bring in bulldozers. He wanted to clear-cut her life's work to make room for a clubhouse at a paved parking lot. I remembered a night in 1996. I'd come home late, my head spinning from a wiretap transcript that linked a local developer to a waste management racketeering scheme. I was exhausted, ready to quit. Evelyn had sat me down right here at this table, handed me a glass of iced tea, and said, "Arthur, the men who build things for the wrong reasons always leave a trail of dust. You just have to wait for the wind to blow it back in their faces." She was the moral spine of everything we owned. This land wasn't just equity or under-leveraged acreage. It was the physical record of our life together. Every stone wall I'd stacked, every tree she'd pruned was a line of testimony against the kind of man Brent was. Brent saw the land as a stepping stone to a higher tax bracket, a way to impress the men at the country club who currently only tolerated him because of my daughter's last name. He saw distressed assets.
I saw the 30 years of mornings Evelyn spent in the dirt, building a home that was meant to be a fortress for our family. I sat there in the dark mudroom, clutching those gloves, and I felt the last of my patience dissolve. It was replaced by a familiar, cold clarity, the same clarity I felt when I walked into a courtroom to deliver an opening statement against a don. Brent wasn't just trying to move me out. He was trying to erase her. He was trying to pave over the only physical evidence I had left of the woman who made me a better man than I deserved to be. I realized then that my daughter, Sarah, was the double front. Brent was using her love for me, her fear for my health, as a weapon against the very thing she was supposed to inherit. He was turning my own blood into a crowbar to pry the deed from my hands. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room. I walked back to the kitchen and placed Evelyn's gloves on the counter, right next to my service revolver. The soil and the steel, the two things that defined my life. "I hear the wind, Evelyn," I whispered. I didn't go to bed. I went to the basement. I had a file to build. A double front requires a double response. One for the face they show the world, and one for the monster hiding in the shadow. I wasn't just going to stop the sale. I was going to dismantle the enterprise.
By 3 a.m., the basement was humming with the low, rhythmic whir of my old desktop tower. It's an air-gapped machine, never connected to the house Wi-Fi, a habit from the days when signals intelligence was the only way to catch a high-level mole. I had the RICO mindset engaged now. In the federal system, you don't just look for a single crime, you look for a pattern of racketeering activity. You look for the enterprise. I started with Julian and his firm, Crestview Acquisitions. On the surface, Julian was a consultant with a clean LinkedIn profile and a series of puff pieces in regional business journals. But I don't read the news. I read the Payback Logs and the FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, suspicious activity reports that I still had back-channel access to through a few old friends at the Bureau who owed me for a 2012 bribery scandal I'd helped them bury. I pulled Julian's corporate tree. It wasn't a tree, it was a briar patch. He had 17 different LLCs registered in Delaware and Nevada, all of them using the same registered agent address in a strip mall in Wilmington. I began to map the predicate acts. I found 3 other land deals in neighboring counties over the last 5 years. In each case, a senior citizen had willingly sold their property to a Crestview subsidiary, only for the property to be flipped 3 days later to a large-scale commercial developer for 4 times the original price. It was a long-firm fraud, a classic maneuver where you build a veneer of legitimacy, gain the trust of a vulnerable party, and then strip the assets through a series of shell transfers that make it impossible to trace the original equity. But the real discovery, the one that made the coffee in my mug go cold, was Brent's involvement. Brent wasn't just a partner, he was the lead generator. I found a private ledger hidden in an encrypted cloud drive that he had foolishly accessed from the secure laptop he'd left in my guest room. Brent had been receiving referral fees for every property Julian closed. He was scouting for Julian. He was hunting in his own social circle, picking off the parents of his friends, the retired judges, the elderly widows at the country club. I used the technical terminology of my trade, laying it out like a federal indictment. 18 U.S. Code Section 1961-1, the Predicate Acts. I documented at least 6 instances of mail fraud and wire fraud tied to the Crestview enterprise. Enterprise corruption. I established the continuity of their criminal activity. This wasn't a one-time mistake, it was their business model. The double front mechanism. I traced the flow of funds. Brent was using Sarah's name, my daughter's name, to co-sign the initial earnest money deposits for Julian's shells. He was essentially using my daughter as a human shield. If the feds ever caught on, the paper trail would lead back to her signature, while Julian and Brent remained unaware of the regulatory clerical errors. I felt a surgical, icy calm.
I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing Julian's bank records with the land deeds. I found the kicker, a $250,000 payment from a major casino developer that was contingent on the acquisition and rezoning of my 30 acres. My land was the missing piece of a much larger puzzle. It was the anchor for a regional corridor they'd been planning for years. Brent hadn't just been gaslighting me about my health, he'd been hiding the true value of the land by a factor of 10. He was willing to rob his own daughter's grandfather to secure a seat at the table with the big boys in the development world. I didn't stop until the sun began to bleed through the small reinforced windows of the basement. I had 212 pages of documented racketeering. I had the nexus between the shell companies. I had the proof of the double front. I sat back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. My hands were as steady as a surgeon's. Brent thought he was playing a game of real estate. He didn't realize he had just provided me with the continuity required to trigger a federal RICO forfeiture. I printed the final summary. The sound of the laser printer was a rhythmic, mechanical verdict. I walked upstairs, made a fresh pot of coffee, grinding the beans myself, 92 rotations, and waited for Brent to show up with his concerns and his paperwork. The enterprise was about to meet the lead executive. The audit in the basement had given me the what and the how, but Saturday morning gave me the why. Jack was sitting on the back porch steps, his chin in his hands, staring out at the valley. He wasn't playing with his toy planes or digging for treasures in the dirt. He looked older than 8. He looked like a boy who had heard a secret he wasn't supposed to know. "Grandpa," he said, not looking at me as I sat down beside him, "am I going to have to go to a different school next year?" I felt a sharp, localized pang in my chest. "Why would you ask that, Jack?" "I heard Daddy talking to that man, Julian," he whispered. "They were in the garage. Daddy said the seed money for the big project had to come from somewhere and that my college fund was just sitting there doing nothing. He said he was borrowing it and he'd put it back tenfold. What's tenfold, Grandpa?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I felt a tectonic shift of fury, a white-hot singular rage that I haven't felt since I stood over the body of a fellow officer in 1994. I went inside, my movements mechanical and precise. I didn't use the air-gapped machine. I used the family computer in the kitchen, the one Brent had upgraded for me so he could monitor my activity. I knew he was watching. I wanted him to see me log in. I accessed Jack's Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, otherwise known as UTMA account. It was a fund Evelyn and I had started the day he was born. Every birthday, every Christmas, every stray day report card, we'd put money in. It was meant to be his escape velocity, the thing that ensured he'd never have to compromise his integrity for a paycheck. The balance was $214.18. 4 months ago, it had been $112,000. Brent hadn't just borrowed it. I traced the transaction history through the back-end administrative portal I still had access to. He'd moved the funds through 3 different escrow shells before landing them in a high-risk margin account held by Crestview Acquisitions. He was using his son's future to seed the very enterprise that was designed to steal his grandfather's land. He was gambling with money that wasn't his to fund a crime that targeted his own blood. In the world of federal prosecution, we call this aggravated embezzlement, but under the RICO statutes, it's a predicate act of wire fraud and theft from an employee benefit plan, or in this case, a custodial trust. But the double front went deeper. I checked my daughter Sarah's personal accounts. Brent had convinced her to co-sign a bridge loan for his business, telling her it was a temporary measure to save the family estate from a phantom tax lien he'd invented. He'd used her credit, her signature, and her fear for my health to tether her to his sinking ship. If Julian's deal went south, Sarah would be the one the banks came for. Brent had designed it so that he was the consultant, but she was the obligor. He was using my daughter as a human shield and my grandson as a venture capital fund. I looked at Jack through the kitchen window. He was still sitting on the steps, a small figure against the vast green backdrop of Evelyn's garden. He looked like a secondary victim in a crime scene he didn't even understand yet. This is the moment the executive storyteller stops being a narrator and starts being an executioner. Brent thought he was a social climber. He thought he was optimizing assets. He didn't realize that when you steal from a child in a house built by a RICO prosecutor, you aren't just committing a crime, you are signing your own death warrant. I picked up the phone. I didn't call the police. I called a man named Marcus, the current chief of the Financial Crimes Unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Marcus," I said. My voice was dry and cold as a winter wind. "It's Arthur. I'm calling in that favor from the 98 Commission. I need a Title III wiretap order and an emergency freeze of assets under 18 U.S.C. 1963. I've got a live racketeering enterprise operating from a residential address. And Marcus, they've touched a minor's trust. I want the nuclear option. I want the mandatory forfeiture." "Arthur, are you sure? That's a heavy hammer to swing at family." "He stopped being family the moment he treated my grandson like a line of credit. Marcus, get the papers ready. I'm bringing them to the closing tomorrow." I hung up. I walked back out to the porch and sat next to Jack. I put my arm around his shoulders. "Jack," I said, "you're going to that school, and your tenfold is coming back. But it's not coming from Daddy. It's coming from the law. Do you know what the law does to people who break their promises?" "What, Grandpa?" "It makes them disappear. Quiet, as a secret. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real."
The trap I constructed for Brent and Julian was a masterpiece of statutory entrapment. In the world of federal prosecution, we don't just wait for the crime to happen. We create a controlled environment where the targets are forced to document their own criminal intent. I needed to solidify the RICO enterprise by forcing them to act in concert across state lines with a singular fraudulent purpose. I didn't push back on the land deal. Instead, I called Brent on Sunday morning, sounding weary and resigned. I let my voice trail off at the end of sentences. I played the part of the man who had finally been convinced by the concern of his betters. "Brent," I said, my voice cracking slightly, "I think you're right. The house, it's too big. Sarah's right to be worried. I want to sign the papers, but I want to do it right. I want a closing ceremony at the Riverbend Country Club. I want Julian there. I want the whole board to see that I'm taking care of my family's future." I heard the audible gasp of air on the other end of the line. To a social climber like Brent, the idea of a public victory lap at the most exclusive club in the county was the ultimate drug. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the coronation. "Pop, that's incredible," Brent stammered. "I'll set it up. Julian will be thrilled. We'll have the champagne ready." Layer 1, the statutory admission. I drafted a supplemental disclosure for the closing. To Brent and Julian, it looked like a standard real estate indemnity form. In reality, I had woven in the specific language required for 18 U.S.C. Section 1962C. By signing it, they were formally declaring their association in fact with a group of shell companies and admitting to the continuity of their business practices. They were signing a confession disguised as a contract. Layer 2, the interstate nexus. I insisted that the earnest money be wired from Julian's Nevada shell account into a specific trust account I had set up for Jack. I gave them the routing numbers for a federal seizure account monitored by the U.S. Marshals. The moment that wire hit the system, The crime moved from a state property dispute to a federal felony using the interstate wire facilities to promote racketeering. Layer 3, the double front reversal. I told Sarah I needed her to be there to witness my signature. I told her I wanted her to see that I was happy with the deal. My goal wasn't to punish her, it was to provide her with exculpatory evidence. By having her present when the federal agents arrived, I was ensuring she would be viewed as a witness to the fraud rather than a co-conspirator. I was stripping Brent's human shield away in real time. I spent Sunday evening in the den, polishing the Model 10 one last time. I wasn't going to use it, of course, but the weight of it in my hand was a reminder of the gravity of the law. I looked at the closing file I had prepared. It was thick, bound in blue legal tape, and contained the pattern of racketeering I'd spent 40 years learning how to identify. Brent thought he was taking me to the club to retire me. He thought he was paving over Evelyn's garden to build a monument to his own ego. He didn't realize that the closing ceremony was actually a sentencing hearing. I tucked the file into my briefcase, the old cracked leather one I'd carried into the most dangerous courtrooms in the country. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The wind was blowing through the oaks, rattling the windows of the house Evelyn and I had built. It was a cold wind, a shark wind, the kind of wind that blows the dust back into the faces of the men who tried to stir it up. "It's time, Evelyn," I whispered. I closed the briefcase. The latches clicked, with a sound as final as a prison door.
The week that followed felt like walking through a thick, gray fog. Elena was at the house every day. She didn't wait for an invite. She simply used her spare key and let herself in, usually with a box of healthy pastries I didn't like and a stack of brochures for senior transition specialists. "Arthur, you forgot to turn the stove off again," she'd say, her voice echoing from the kitchen while I was upstairs. I'd walk down, confused, knowing I hadn't made anything since my morning toast. I'd find the burner glowing red, a small puddle of water boiling away in a pot I hadn't touched. "I'm worried, honey," she'd whisper, daubing at her eyes. "The neighbors said they saw you wandering the garden at 3 a.m. You were looking for the books, they said. Do you remember that?" I hadn't been in the garden at 3 a.m. I had been asleep, dreaming of the rhythmic ticking of the clock. But she said it with such practiced sorrow, such a convincing mask of familial dread, that I found myself checking the mud on my slippers. I found myself looking in the mirror and wondering if the man staring back was finally starting to fray at the edges. "I've moved the rest of the downstairs files to the storage unit," she told me on Thursday, casually sipping her green juice. "It's better this way. You don't need to be burdened by the past. I've even started a legacy folder for you on the iPad. Everything is just a click away." I tried to use the iPad, I really did, but the password she gave me didn't work, and when I asked her about it, she sighed, a long, weary sound of a woman exhausted by a burden she never asked for. "I gave you the code 4 times yesterday, Arthur. It's Sophie's birthday, 0611218. Try to keep up for her sake." The code didn't work. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. In my career, I've seen this play out 100 times. It's called capacity engineering. You create an environment of failure around a person until they surrender their autonomy just to make the confusion stop. I've seen trustees use it to seize corporate assets, and I've seen children use it to seize their parents' dignity. I sat in my chair that evening, the house feeling strangely empty without the weight of my filing cabinets. Elena had even taken the small brass scale that sat on my desk, a gift from the chief judge when I retired. "It's a dust magnet, Pop," she'd said. I looked at the grandfather clock. It was the only thing she hadn't touched. It was too heavy, too rooted. I realized that if I let her continue, I'd be just like that brass scale, gone, forgotten, and replaced by a modern version of my own life that I didn't recognize.
She brought over a notary on Friday evening, a man named Silas with a weak chin and eyes that moved too fast. He had a stack of papers clipped to a board. "Just some medical proxy updates, Arthur," Elena said, her hand resting heavily on my shoulder. "So I can talk to your doctors with all the red tape. You trust me, don't you?" I looked at the signature line. My hand felt heavy. I looked at Sophie, who was playing with her dolls on the rug. She looked up and smiled at me, a bright, honest smile that didn't have a single lie in it. "I'll sign it tomorrow, Elena," I said, my voice sounding more tired than I felt. "I need my glasses. I think I left them upstairs." "I'll get them," she offered quickly. "No," I said, standing up. "I'll get them. I know exactly where they are." I walked upstairs, but I didn't go for my glasses. I went to the floorboard under my bed. I pulled back the rug and lifted the loose plank. Inside was a small black ledger, the one Elena hadn't found. I wrote down the date. I wrote down Silas's name. I wrote down the Riverbend Country Club was a fortress of white pillars and green velvet, the kind of place where the old money goes to hide from the rest of the world. Brent was in his glory. He'd rented a private dining room overlooking the 18th green. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first tractor, and he was holding a glass of vintage champagne like it was a scepter. Julian was there too, looking sleek and dangerous in a charcoal gray blazer. And Sarah, my daughter, sat at the end of the long mahogany table, her hand shaking as she reached for her water. "To the future," Brent toasted, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "To the anchor property, the piece that makes it all possible." Julian smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. "To the anchor property, the piece that makes it all possible." I sat at the head of the table, my briefcase resting on my lap like a sleeping dog. I didn't drink the champagne. I didn't smile. I just watched Brent's hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady with the arrogance of a man who thinks he's already won. "Are we ready to sign, Arthur?" Julian asked, sliding a thick stack of documents across the table. "In a moment, Julian," I said. My voice was low, flat, and carried a weight that seemed to suck the air out of the room. "Before we sign, I'd like to introduce a few character witnesses I've invited. I felt it was important for the board of this club to understand exactly who they're welcoming into their circle." Brent frowned. "Pop, what are you talking about? It's just us." I stood up and walked to the door. I opened it, and 3 people walked in. They were old, older than me. Mrs. Higgins, whose farm had been acquired by Crestview last year. Mr. Sterling, who had lost his retirement home to a zoning variance Brent had scouted 3 years ago. And Judge Whitaker, a man Julian had scammed 3 years ago. "Brent, Julian," I said, walking back to the table, "these are the victims of the Crestview racketeering enterprise. They're here to witness the closing." Brent's face went from flush to a sickly grayish white. "Pop, this is insane. These people they're just confused. They're just disgruntled sellers." "No, Brent," I said. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the blue-bound file. I slammed it on the mahogany table. The sound was like a gunshot. I turned to Julian. "Julian, the $250,000 wire you sent this morning from your Nevada shell, it didn't go to Jack's trust. It went to a federal seizure account. You just committed wire fraud in furtherance of a racketeering enterprise on a federal monitor. That's a 20-year enhancement under the federal sentencing guidelines." Julian stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You're bluffing, you old bastard. You're retired. You're a ghost." "A ghost who still knows how to haunt," I said. I looked at Sarah. "Sarah, honey, look at me. Brent told you I was senile. He told you I was wandering the garden at night. He said I was a danger to myself. He did that so he could use your signature as a shield while he stole your son's college fund." Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Jack's fund? Brent, you said it was safe. You said you were optimizing it." He was optimizing it into Julian's pocket, Sarah. I turned to Brent. He was trembling now, his glass of champagne spilling on his expensive suit. Brent, I've spent 30 years taking down men much smarter and much more dangerous than you. You thought I was a target because I was quiet. You thought I was a victim because I was kind. But in this room, in this club, in this state, I am the lead executive. And you're just a line item in a forfeiture order. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a small black radio. I pressed the button. Marcus, bring the nuclear option in. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room burst open. 6 men in navy blue windbreakers with FBI and U.S. Marshal in gold lettering flooded into the room. Marcus, the chief of financial crimes, walked straight to Julian and Brent. Julian Vane, Brent Torn, you are under arrest for violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 1962, racketeer influenced and corrupt organizations. We have a warrant for your records, your assets, and your immediate detention. Brent collapsed into his chair. He didn't look like a social climber anymore. He looked like a man who had finally realized the mountain he was climbing was actually a gallows. "Daddy?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, Sarah," I said, walking over and taking her hand. "The enterprise is closed, the land is safe, and Jack's college fund, it's being restored by the federal government tonight." I watched them lead Brent and Julian in handcuffs. I watched the old money members of the club staring in shocked silence as the disruptors were dragged away. I picked up the blue-bound file. I tucked it back into my briefcase. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel relief. I just felt the quiet, steady rhythm of the law. I walked out of the club, past the white pillars and the green velvet. The air outside was cool and smelled of the valley. I looked up at the stars. "The wind blew, Evelyn," I whispered, "just like you said it would." I wasn't forgetting. I was documenting. And in a court of law, documentation is the only thing that survives the fire. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely.
It's been 6 months since the closing ceremony at Riverbend. The federal government is thorough when it comes to RICO. Julian is currently serving 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Brent is serving 8. He lost his car, his country club membership, and his social standing. But more importantly, he lost the right to ever be near my grandson again. The $112,000 he stole from Jack's UTMA account was recovered through a mandatory forfeiture action against Julian's Nevada assets. The law might be slow, but it has a very long reach when it comes to the secondary victims of racketeering. Sarah is back in the house with me. She's healing. She's learning to trust her own eyes again and not the whispers of a predator. And Jack? Jack is back in the garden. We were out by the hydrangeas this morning. Jack found a small, rusted skeleton key buried in the red clay. "Is this the key to a secret kingdom, Grandpa?" he asked, holding it up to the sun. "It's a piece of the truth, Jack," I told him, "and the truth is the only thing that can't be paved over." I'm sitting on the back porch now. The sun is setting over the valley, casting long golden shadows across the land Evelyn and I built. I've got my manual grinder out. 92 rotations. The resistance of the beans is a comfort. The smell of the coffee is a grounding force. I look at the old service revolver on the table next to me. It's clean. It's oiled. It's ready. But I don't think I'll be needing it for a long, long time. The garden is blooming. The enterprise is liquidated. The books are balanced. I take a sip of my coffee. It's hot, strong, and tastes like peace.
I look out at the 30 acres that will never be a parking lot. The work is finally done. The executive is retired. And the story? The story is over. The log is closed. This concludes the RICO Prosecutor's Reckoning. Would you like to begin a new narrative with another title or explore a different professional weapon?